You are going live.
Hello! We're live! Do we have anyone here?
I would guess no right now. No.
Probably. But when you get here, put your name in the chat so we know that you're here. Today we have a lot of things in store, so we're gonna need to know who is here, and hopefully you'll be able to interact with all of the stuff that we've prepared. So, yeah, tell me about your week. What'd you do? What was a fun thing that happened this week?
This week I have started packing my things up in my apartment.
Right, because you're moving.
I'm moving at the end of the month, which is an exciting factor. But I took down all of my decorations in my room.
The Spences are here.
Spence girls are here.
Hi, Spences.
Glad to have you.
Yeah, but I took down a lot of the decorations in my room because those are easy to start packing because that's not an essential aspect.
Right.
So took some of that stuff down. I'll just slowly make things and pack things up instead of trying to hurry and not know where anything is.
Right.
The day of, if that makes sense. Yeah. How was your week?
My week was pretty good. What have I done this week? I feel like this week was pretty normal, you know, just working, love my job. So it that was, I don't know, it's just been fun, gathering information for this. It's when you learn about stuff in school that you don't care about, doing research for it is awful.
Yes.
Just absolutely so boring and pulling teeth is just terrible. But then when you do research for stuff that you enjoy or that you're interested about, then it's fun. It's like a scavenger hunt, or it's you're a detective and you're trying to get down to the the case or whatever it might be. Right. So
which I think is a very great transition into what we're talking about.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Because I did not do any research of any of this because it's not something that I was interested in high school. Couldn't say that I'm interested in it totally right now either.
For sure.
So I did not do a lot of this research, but Sarah did because she is interested in it.
Yeah.
And so today we're going to be talking about evolution. And like I said, not interested in any of this. I actually decided to go on a very different path than this in college. I am an English major, so as far away from science as I could get. But Sarah here is a health and human phys major on the pre-med track. So she is as much science as you can get. So that is where our opposites are really shown in what we're interested in, which is not a really bad thing. I mean, you can be really good friends with someone that you're not interested in the same things and still find that common ground that you guys share. So because I did not take that science route, I did not have a lot of prior knowledge about evolution. I went through the motions, I guess you could say, in high school, just to kind of pass the class to get me on to the next class. But Sarah did pay attention and was one of those students that probably paid more attention than I did.
I had my days, but yeah hopefully.
So, Sarah, just to kind of get us started, because I don't know a lot about it.
Sure.
Could you just simply maybe define evolution for us?
Yeah. So before I even get started, let me preface that everything that you're about to see today is mostly my words or a source that I've cited. And so, you might hear it phrased in a different way, but I did my best, right? Considering my bias, I did my best to remain in a neutral way, to just word things in a way that is understandable from any education level. Whether you're in middle school or whether you're in high school or whether you're out of school, my goal was to phrase things in a way that you can understand while remaining as true as possible. And so I'm not gonna, make the claim that everything that I've done is perfect and infallible, but my intentions were honest, and I did my best to kind of present as many facts as possible, or as many sides as possible. And so I just want to say, as we go through this content, make your own thoughts and conclusions. Don't take my word for it. Don't take Lindsay's word for it. Don't take, a person's word for it. Honestly seek in your heart to seek truth and ask the Lord to grant you wisdom. And, much of this might be hard, but God is good. And so let's just get to the bottom of this. So evolution, as I've phrased it, there are probably many other ways you could say, is the scientific theory that proposes to explain the genetic change of a species or a group of organisms or things that live over time as random. So that is what I would say evolution is.
Okay, so kind of like dumbing it down so I can kind of have a, understanding of it a little bit more. Would you say it's basically like just a change over time?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
Change over time to survive.
Okay.
Right? So there's, parts of evolution that say like to reproduce, to create things that are you, and to survive. Because if you die, you don't do that.
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense to me. It paints a good picture of just basically what evolution is on the very base ground. But then what
Sure.
would be the flip side of evolution? So maybe like creationism.
Right.
What would you define that as?
Right. So creationism is the true account or true biblical account of God creating life intentionally. So you can see that these kind of present two sides, right? So the first one in evolution, take note of the word random, and then in creationism, take note of the word intentional. Those will, I think, just have those float in your mind because we will hit those from different angles as we go on.
I like how you put those words. Words make sense in my
Right,
brain, being an
right.
English
They
major.
mean something.
Right, and so those two words will help me now, kind of as we go through and unpack
Mhm.
more that evolution is more random based, where creation is more intentionally based. Awesome. That makes sense to me. So Sarah, why don't we kind of continue? Why don't we go a little bit further now, since we have those two basic? I know that there's other different theories and all these other different things in this realm of evolution. Do you want to maybe kind of simplify those or give me the definition of those too as we continue on?
Right. So in any person, the way that they view the world will shape how they interact with this information. And so your worldview perspective largely shapes what you're going to see this as, how you interpret the data and statistics and other information. And on either side, in my opinion, people have to place their faith in something because at any point, there's not ever going to be an exact, measurable, perfectly proven thing at every step of the way. And so that, I think, is really important. So there are hypotheses, guesses, and probabilities throughout evolution, and that's really important to take note of. But as we said, worldview shapes how you interpret this perspective. And so the first worldview I want to bring into center stage is naturalism. And so naturalism is this perspective saying that there is nothing on this earth or in our universe that we cannot scientifically measure in some way, or miracles don't exist, meaning there's an answer for everything, and it is something that is within the physical world, in our palpable, I can touch it, I can see it, so it is real thing. And then on the other side, there's deism or theism, and within these, multiple other specific perspectives. So not just Christianity, but other religions. But they kind of come from this deism or theism mindset saying that a divine being interceded at some point to set this universe in motion. And that divine being, we cannot fully measure or fully or perfectly understand it. In parentheses, miracles do exist. Some things happen that I cannot perfectly determine an answer for.
I think that makes...
Yeah, lots of words, but
Right.
hopefully that kind of shows that, so then when we get into the data later, these other things that we see, people are going to look at this from one of these two perspectives most often. And so when you're having conversations with your friends about this, whether there is an English class or whether it's in science class, they're going to be more of it's better to understand who you're talking to, so that way you can be oh, I see that you believe this because of this, so let's talk about what that means, and that will really, really help.
Yeah.
I think there's a really important conclusion to draw, though, as well, just to separate. Naturalism does not necessarily equal science. So when someone is a naturalist, meaning that they believe that miracles don't exist, you can't just be science only. And what I mean by that is naturalism is a belief system, but science is a methodology of study. So naturalist is a perspective, and then science is a tool. So you can be on the other side in a deism or theism mindset, but still value science and still use science as a tool.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
How are you feeling? I just threw a lot at you.
That's a lot of definitions, but I think it definitely covers a lot of that base ground as we go into some more things to just know those things in the back of my mind instead of just be given all these information. But clearly, I mean, it's evident. I learned this in school. You learned this in school. We're going to be learning about this in school. So as we go through the motions in school, can we look at more of the things that we're going to be learning or like seeing, I guess, in our textbooks too, or in a magazine article or on the news or anything like that? Can we maybe unpack those a little bit more too for me to have like a little bit more of an understanding as I'm reading something to then, you know, base or draw my own conclusions, like you were stating, to do the research on your own, come up with your own beliefs too, and stuff like that.
Sure. So making my own hypotheses or like guesses and perceptions of things to own my own stance has been something that has taken a lot of time to develop, and over time comes confidence with that. And so like if you're a viewer and you know you're like somewhere in the middle and you just don't really know how to interact with this information, that's okay. It's totally okay to see things and be like, man, I just don't know. Sometimes it just takes time to really understand or to develop what you know. And so it's taken me quite a bit of time to really like parse through information to draw conclusions and say, okay, what does this really mean? Especially if you read academic texts. I mean, the English major, right? Like some of that stuff is just hard because they say something and they mean something, but it's not always clear what that conclusion is. And so I just want to like give the viewers and you and, you know, me just a little bit of that break that we don't need to understand it right away because ultimately God is good and God is going to, you know, do his will, but we still have brains that he's gifted us with where we can understand things. And so just like we exercised, you know, to run and be healthy, going through educational content does the same with our brain. So the first thing I would like to look at is, Mike, the next slide. Would you be willing to put it? Perfect. So this is a common picture that you will see in your textbooks, or if you get to college and you take a biology course, you'll see this as well. And it's commonly, like, it's just called homology, which is a word to say things come from something else similarly. So, but let's just look at this diagram. So I just really want to rest on this diagram. If you haven't seen this, that's okay. Let me explain to you what you're looking at. So there are 4 organisms or things: a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. And then there are bone structures within them. So we have bones, other animals have bones as well. And so that is what we're looking at, specifically their appendage or their arm. And it has been color coordinated and supersized to be next to each other. And so I'm not going to make a claim specifically about evolution, but what I am going to do is kind of show you how I look at things in class. So when I look at this diagram, I really want to be careful that I am drawing my own conclusions versus reading something and accepting that it's true. Because I think for so much of my schooling before I became a Christian, I was just like, yep, they said it, I believe it, their job is to teach me, so it must be true. But it's not necessarily super intuitive if you look at this diagram. I mean, the scale from a human to a whale is not that.
Right.
The scale from a human to a bat is not that. And if you don't color code these bone structures, in my personal understanding, I don't know that high school Sarah would have seen the similarity there. So this is commonly used for evolution, but the problem is it doesn't specifically show transitionary species. So if we said evolution is a scientific theory that proposes to explain genetic changes of species over time, meaning that they change from something to something else to something else to something else, then we should see a human and then like a human whale hybrid and then a human less whale hybrid and something else if they all have a common ancestor. And that's not often or commonly found in our fossils. So my whole point with this slide to you viewers is when we look at our textbooks, we assume that they're true, but we should be careful about that because sometimes scales are off or things are color coordinated in a way that draw conclusions that we might not draw on our own. And so it's just good to get into the habit of, taking a magnifying glass and truly investigating at what we're looking. So someone could easily say when they look at this diagram, is there a common ancestor or is there a common creator because their bone structures are similar? God might have said, I'm not God, so I don't know. I wasn't there when he made everything, but he might have, looked at this and been like, it works so perfectly for this animal that I'm going to use a similar structure for this animal. And that could just as easily explain within the little context given in this diagram what their origin was.
Right. I think that makes a lot of sense for my eyes, just like looking at this photo too. I mean, when going through it, what you said, like, if it's in my textbook, it must be true, or, I must just believe that. But I love how you said that common ancestor or common creator, because it's evident that maybe this structure in our bones is working. So, maybe God did want to use that in a cat because it's working, or anything like that, or a cat, then a human. That makes a lot of sense. Is there other things, though? Maybe, I know I've heard of many, theories by other different, I don't know what you call them, scientists, evolutionists, I don't know that exact terminology, that would maybe illustrate evolution also, aside from just this illustration.
Yeah, so one of the commonly used ones is Asian timeline. So I'm not going to go super far into this because at any point with the stuff that we give, there are rabbit trails that you could truly follow for a really long time. And also, a lot of the stuff that we provided today isn't, only what you're going to see. I've just chosen the most common ones that are referred to. So a lot of the times evolution is this process or theory that is proposed to happen over time. So it takes a long time to occur. Not that one day this thing went to bed as a rabbit and woke up as something else. It's that it takes a lot of time, survival of the fittest, kind of nature taking its course over a long time to happen. And so when we look at fossils and we look at these things, we use this thing called radiometric dating, or we use elements on the periodic table, specifically their isotopes, that over time decay. And so if we know the time at which that decays, then we can use that to guesstimate how old something is based on how much of that isotope is left in that thing. But as we see on this quick quote from the United States Geological Survey, this is the first paragraph on their page for age and timeline of the Earth. The red things that I've bolded here is just to show the doubt that's there. Scientists have not found a way to determine exact age of the Earth directly from rocks found on Earth because they're just not there. We haven't found them or they've been destroyed. And then it says, they've determined the probable age of the solar system because on the pretense that the Earth, or that the solar system was created by the Big Bang, and so if the moon is this old, then the Earth must be this old because they were created at the same time. By assuming that they were all formed at the same time and so therefore the same age. So it's just within government websites or within scientists, it's at some level, somewhere, assumptions are being made. And so it's just really important to us when we hear facts, like we said earlier, it's my inclination to just accept what they're saying is true. But as I've grown, I've learned to say, okay, but what does that really mean? Assuming. So you're taking a step of faith there a little bit. So there's some wiggle room. And this just opens up space for a dialogue between people so we can find a common understanding that we're both on both sides not completely sure at some level at some point. The two other points on this slide that I just really want to make quickly is that radiometric dating tools are often influenced by the atmosphere. So this is where some of that doubt comes in. Whether it's a rock from the Earth or whether it's a bone or a piece of cloth found, if it's carbon or if it's uranium or other things, the half-lives of those isotopes have to be constant in order to be reliable. And if they can change in certain conditions, then that means that they're not constant in a lot of circumstances. or I should say in several circumstances at least. I don't want to make too big of a leap there. But because that statement can be made, the infallibility of these tools comes into question. And so it just sheds another glimpse of light that it's not bulletproof. It's not completely solid fact that negates any possible room for conversation. There's room to have dialogue. So
I definitely think what you bolded here in the red or orange definitely would leave room for dialogue.
Right.
Because
right.
that's not something set in stone.
Right. If you were to put those words into any other context, would you be certain? Hey, so I fixed your brakes on your car, and we changed this thing, and we used our calipers, and we're assuming that there's probability, but we're not certain, right? Like, even if it's a small amount, like, there's room to talk about that and be a little concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I took 1 year of genetics, but
sure.
half-lives, that term or that phrase has reminded me maybe a little bit about genetics and maybe about our DNA. And I know that's another common thing talked about. I mean, it's a whole class that I took, aside from just science. So do you want to maybe go into more of our DNA or genetics into evolution?
Right. So I think it's one of the most commonly things I've heard of in class or even in high school is that, like, we came from monkeys or that, like, we share, monkeys. So, hey, Mike, would you mind going to the next slide? Great, thanks. So chimpanzee DNA, right? Yeah. So the first point, I think, is that let's go to those numbers there on the left. Chimpanzees share 98% of our genome as humans. And before we even say that, like, when you see that, you're like, 98%, oh my gosh, that's so much. But first, regardless of how much we share, then the quote at the top, although humans and chimps have many identical genes, we often use them in different ways. So just because I have this protein or this mechanism in my body doesn't mean that it performs the same exact function in the same way for me because we're separate organisms, right? And so it's just important to say just because we're sharing DNA doesn't mean that we came from the same thing or that we are the same thing. So let's go back to the numbers. Chimpanzees share 98% of our genome. Well, so do chickens, but with 60%. Do you look at that 98% the same now when you see chickens share 68% of our genome?
No.
Yeah, or how about the third point? Bananas share 50% of our genome. Do you look at that 98% the same?
Absolutely.
I mean, I don't look at you and say 50% banana.
Right.
So what are we saying? So just to clarify, a genome is the sequencing of DNA in our bodies. Every cell has copies, and if you take a cell out of our body, you can go into the nucleus and see the DNA in our chromosomes. Commonly, we've heard of chromosomes, females XX chromosome, males XY chromosome for the sex chromosomes, right? Those are words that we've heard before. But let's specifically look at within genomes are genes. In this quote over here on the right, genes are the regions that are of our DNA that code for proteins. Proteins, commonly referred to as the building blocks for life. And they only make up 2% of your DNA. So this quote about the bananas, if we share 50% of our DNA with them, it doesn't mean that we're 50% banana. It means that we share 1% of our genes. So then with the chimpanzees, that's almost 100%. So if 50% banana, 100% chimpanzee, so then it would be, following the math, 2% of our genes or so. And so that is important to consider because it's not all of your DNA, it's of the genes in your genome for proteins. So it scoping out a little bit, there's some uncovered that isn't in chimpanzees. So then the question is, like, does that mean that we're monkey? Not necessarily. It just means that we have similar things. And then if you go out into the universe, go out into the earth at least, you find proteins. There are some proteins that exist in plants that we have. There are some proteins that don't exist in plants that we make or can't make So that's why we eat meat and other things. So proteins exist everywhere. So just because it exists somewhere else doesn't mean that we and that thing are the same. They're everywhere. You could tear off like a leaf from a plant and find proteins in it. They're not only in human. Our DNA genome is, well, similarities with certain genes doesn't necessarily mean that most of it is similar. It means that some of it is similar, and of that part that's similar, there's, things to compare.
So now kind of transitioning into the next thing.
Yeah. Let's talk about something else.
Yeah. The word proteins reminds me a lot of bacteria. I don't know if I've learned the two together, but the idea of bacteria, in science class, looking at bacteria under a microscope, something like that. What is it with bacteria that kind of goes along into the evolution talk that we're doing?
Yeah, so before I even kind of read what is on this slide, I really want to scope back out to evolution itself and just talk about how we see it as two moving parts. So evolution commonly in school is used as this kind of catch-all term for a lot of different things. But in my mind, and I'm making this conclusion, your teachers might not make this, but I believe this to make sense. There are two kinds almost. There's macroevolution and there is microevolution. But they would just say it's all just evolution in one kind of concept. So macroevolution is species change from common ancestors by natural selection genetically. That's a lot of words, but essentially our DNA changes in a way that promotes the survival of the fittest and eventually changes so much that something becomes something else. I don't believe that this is true. This is just, in the theory of evolution, a conclusion that they draw, and I just want to define it a little bit more because it's not as easily and intuitively defined this way, but I think when you look at it in this way, it makes a lot more sense of what they're saying. Because they would say, no, it's just all evolution. And it's important to understand that different things happen in different evolutionary cases. So we'll get to the bacterial resistance as microevolution.
Yeah.
So microevolution is, oh my gosh, why can I not see it on this paper? Essentially that things is a change within a species. So if something changes to evolve or adapt to that situation. So bacterial resistance is an example of, in my mind, microevolution. So it's commonly referred as like bacteria, and you take medicine and antibiotics specifically, and it becomes resistant. It has learned how to survive without being killed off by that medicine. So if you see this diagram over here, one of the purple ones at the beginning, they are resistant, and so they make this new thing, right? And then again, they survive, and then it happens, and it happens, and it happens. And you can see this in a lab. This does happen. But the important conclusion to draw is that it remains bacteria. They don't change species. You don't see a bacteria and then it's, now it's a virus, or now it's yeast, or now it's some amoeba or something like that. Bacteria begin and end as bacteria in this case. So it might be more accurate to say, rather than they're evolving and it's evolution, in a macro scale, it's microevolution, and they're adapting and they're changing to their surroundings. And so I just really wanted to point that out, that when you look at all of these supporting evidences in our textbooks, whether it's like animals, they're changing certain characteristics, or a lot of evolution evidence is DNA and genetic based, like you said, proteins and genes and bacteria. It's important to know that microevolution, I don't think is not true. I actually think that it does happen, and I believe that it doesn't debunk the Bible. I think it makes sense. And I think that microevolution occurs as species change in themselves, but they don't become a new species. And it's also, I think, really important to know, and we'll get into this on the next slide as well, that as far as my knowledge, I have not seen sufficient evidence, or especially measurable observation, and I'll define what those words mean in a second, to support and prove macroevolution. So what I mean by measurable observation is that the person that was there at the beginning was there at the end, and they witnessed a macroevolutionary change. So if, I don't know, we take a plant that is an apple tree or whatever, and we witness over time it changing into a pumpkin. It just doesn't happen. And that might not be super accurate in like the sense of like my example. That's because I made it up on the spot. But my point remains true that like there has not been a measurable, witnessed macroevolution to take place. Just non-witnessed things that have been found to support the conclusion, but it's theoretical in my opinion. So
I think this idea of micro versus macro evolution also brings into the Galapagos Islands that you kind of, I don't think we briefly mentioned it.
But we should.
Yeah, I know that word. I've been taught that word, at least said that word in class. Do you want to kind of explain that micro versus macro with that Galapagos Islands? Because it's something that I think we might be taught or told about in class.
Mike, I don't know if you got a chance to put the Darwin slide on the PowerPoint or on the like OBS. Do you have it?
Which one?
The Darwin Origins of Species slide.
The very first
slide.
one.
I know, but it is the very first slide.
So I don't know if
just,
they have the.
Right there.
Yep, there it is. Cool. So, we were supposed to say that a long time ago, and you never put it up, so I just wasn't sure if we got to it. It's totally fine. No big deal. Here we are. It's great.
engagement combat.
So the Galapagos finches is one of the experiments. Might not be the perfect word, but
Observation.
things that like Darwin, this scientist, studied while on the Galapagos Islands. And so he got to the islands, there's several of them, and he was like, wow, there's birds on all of these islands. This is Sarah's like parsed version, so please read the textbook and like, you know, get some better information. But essentially this is what happened. Yeah, like I said, don't take my word for it. But essentially, he showed up, saw all these finches, but then he noticed that they were different. And so he was like, wow, this is like really weird. I wonder what happens. And so he studies them. He sees how the food that they have changes and how the birds exhibit different changes in their beak size in order to survive. And so it's like this survival of the fittest kind of mechanism starts happening. And so on the left of this slide here is specifically from Darwin's Origin of Species, and it is his hypothesis and his claim specifically about natural selection or survival of the fittest. And so I'm not going to read it to you. You can read, but it's lots of words. And then Lindsay can go ahead and read its summed theory and thesis in the red.
Yeah, which is just basically stating that over time, small changes randomly occur to make a species more fit to survive. At times attributed to changes in species.
Right.
And so
the part at the end is where we have a big problem. At times attributed to changes in species. So this means something was something and then changed into a completely different thing. So it started as a bear and changed as a bird or something. Or it started as this thing, you know, this weird, I don't know, lizard weird thing that we don't have anymore. But then it became a gecko. That isn't necessarily true in my opinion. Not true at all, actually. But anyway, the point is Darwin and a lot of evolutionists and scientists will, in textbooks, will say that this is evidence for macroevolution, but it's not, because the finches never changed from finches. This would be, I would say, microevolution. They started as finches, they ended as finches, they changed to become more fit to survive. And I don't disagree that that doesn't happen. What I do disagree with is that they become different things. It just doesn't happen. And this is entirely my opinion. I'm willing to stake my claim on it, that it just doesn't happen. And people, you know, we can talk about more about that, what that looks like. But in my opinion, it is microevolution. The species never changed. So I'm not necessarily arguing that evolution itself doesn't happen. I'm arguing about the ways that they say it does happen. So I'm saying macroevolution doesn't happen. This thing does not become a completely different thing no matter how much time you give it. Its genetics can change, that's fine. It's, you know, it can have a new beak, whatever it may be, but it does not become a new species. So that is where I'm going to draw the line between macro and micro. Yeah. So,
and I think it's important that they'll talk about a couple of different, they might talk about the moths in England during the Industrial Revolution.
Never heard of
Somebody
it.
studied them. Moths changing colors. That, as far as I
Oh, it's like a
understand.
survival mechanism, sure.
Mhm. Right, like if you're a really white moth and there's a bunch of soot around, you stand out. So the darker moths survived and they changed
I don't
colors.
disagree with that.
But that, I
And
mean,
you don't
again,
change species, right? So like, one of the ones that I will never forget, just because I thought it was funny in bio class, was like birds. Birds, they have pretty colors, and my hand, they can't see it. They have pretty colors, and they have mating rituals, and several other animals do this too. But specifically, I remember the birds, and so some birds make funny calls. Some birds are colorful. Peacocks are beautiful, and so they say, you know, the prettiest peacock, male peacock, will reproduce because the women think that it's pretty, and so they're like, all right, I want that one. He's gonna make effective children to survive because they don't have consciousnesses in the way that we do, and so they don't make like, you know, independent thoughts in that way where we're like, it doesn't matter, there's no like emotion, whatever. We can talk about that stuff later. But essentially, that is something that I was taught in school, and I don't disagree that doesn't happen. I do believe that animals can evolve to get certain traits more likely to survive, but what I disagree with is that they change to become something different. So if I were to take a non-scientific explanation of that, is like those Animorph books that they were in like high school or middle school that people would read.
they were dope.
Did you read those?
Yes.
I never read them, but I
When I
saw
was
the
a nerd.
cover, and you see that person like morphing into like this weird thing. That kind of stuff, that kind of macro evolution, I don't believe happens. And I don't believe that there's enough science to support it. And even if we go, if you, on our last slide is resources, and you don't have to turn there now, Mike, but essentially if you go through those, one of my resources was specifically Darwin's Origin of Species, his thing, the thing that created the theory of evolution, that thing, that publication, I guess might be the more better word for it. He even in himself addresses potential problems with his theory. And it's that if we don't find these things in fossils, these in between, these intermediate, like that middle Animorph character fossil, if we don't find that, then my theory doesn't hold up because it needs to have that physical evidence. And as far as I am educated to, remember, I'm not an expert. I'm just like decently educated at an undergraduate level. I worked hard in school. I paid attention. I tried to get it. It just doesn't happen.
Mhm.
So I really hope that like my professor doesn't like come back and attack me for kind of negating everything that he worked very hard to educate me on. But I'm making a stand for myself. So
You are. I think that was great. A better understanding of that difference between micro and macro. When I
Yeah,
hear
yeah.
that, it's just like very intimidating.
yeah,
That was one of those I will go through the motions on those and believe, I guess, what I'm reading in the textbook,
Mhm.
just so I don't
Mhm.
have to think about it after science class, if that
Mhm.
makes sense. But this next slide, the Haeckel's false theory,
Mhm.
I think is another theory that I have heard about. You know, went through the motions again.
In one ear, out the
Yep,
other.
uh-huh.
Okay, next
Yeah.
period. I
So-
got 15 minutes till lunch.
Right.
Right.
Can we maybe talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, so of course, all of this is a really quick once over. I'm gonna leave out a lot, or I might like, I might say something that isn't as clear as to what I mean. So I just really want the viewers and you and Mike and myself to all acknowledge that like, this isn't a perfect presentation because I'm not a perfect person. So. This is my best. And I really did work so hard on this presentation. So, like, if you don't think this is my best, then, like, well, I don't know what to tell you because several hours went into this. But Haeckel's false theory is
That is an incorrect statement. Not several hours.
like tens.
This has been between 24 and 32.
Yeah.
Would be the amount of time you
Yeah,
spent
a
on
lot,
this.
lots of days. I worked really hard because I really care. And yeah, so I'm not attacking anyone. This isn't an us versus them thing. This is a Sarah's opinions, thoughts, and ideas. And I think that it is biblical. And so it's Sarah's biblically informed thoughts and ideas. And looking at what is so commonly said as like substantial fact, bulletproof, unarguable, infallible. And so the last thing, and one of the most commonly I would say anticipated, or maybe I don't even know, interacting. What is the word I'm looking for? Most commonly seen. There we go. Geez, commonly seen diagram. And on the right here is various animals in utero or in womb, embryos, babies, right? Cells. So before they're born, obviously. So Haeckel was a scientist. And I'm not going to give a backstory because I don't really know a lot of it, but I do know that he made this theory that is ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Big mouthful. But that top phrase right there is the theory. If humans came from monkeys or fish, then when humans are in the womb, they would depict those traits. Meaning, if we came from a monkey or a fish from some sort of common ancestor, then these things on the side would look like that. Like would have those structures. So if we had a tail, like we were from monkeys, then our in utero or our infant baby in the womb would have that. And it just doesn't happen. And so it's commonly used in our textbooks in the section about evolution. And it's not a true diagram. And so often people who, put those in their textbooks or teachers that use it to teach in their classrooms will say like, well, I'm not using it to make direct evidence to evolution. It's more that it supports this frame of logic. And it's a really abstract leap to make that claim, because if you're using it, if you're building a case, let's say we're lawyers and we have all these things and, we present evidence and we say, okay, well, this isn't specific evidence to like prove my point, but it goes with my logic. You just don't do that. That just doesn't make any sense. In any other scenario, it wouldn't be possible or effective or allowed, but here it is. And so I need to call into question. And so this quote at the bottom is from a source that is on our references page, which is evolutionnews.org or something like that. But I would say not a necessarily biblical source, not a source arguing for creation. And they were doing an investigation about this diagram that's commonly known to be false. And in their investigation, please go read it. They were talking about how they see, they overlay a different design from a textbook that argues that they don't use this falsely, and it's exactly the same. And so this quote says, "We are presently highlighting some textbooks that use Haeckel's fraudulent embryo drawings to promote evolution. These textbooks use Haeckel's drawings to assert that they represent factual evidence for evolution in the present day." So the words that I wish I would have gone back and highlighted is that this source, non-Christian, is acknowledging that it's a fraudulent theory, and that it's used presently to explain evolution. So it's not true. What?
The picture that you have.
Yes, the theory and the picture, they have to be used together.
But the picture itself, like he hand drew.
Sure, I'm not making that claim right now. I'm saying what I'm saying for a reason.
All right,
so,
sounds good.
This theory, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, or like we said, if we are from monkeys or fish, then our embryonic structures would depict that. It is not true. And so this diagram was used to create, to go with that claim. It's a figure. It's supposed to go with that hypothesis. Since that hypothesis is false, this diagram also is false because it doesn't depict those structures. And so this source is saying that, and I even in one of the talks that I listened to yesterday, they said similar things of like, that it's not fact, but it's presented in a way that the reader would anticipate it to be fact. And it's really important to understand that, like, if that's true, if that's happening in our textbooks, if I remember seeing this in my textbook, then is the credibility of this whole textbook in question? It should be, because if they're willing to use something that's not necessarily an A to B to C scenario conclusion about evolution, then is that true for other things? And so, yeah, I could go on and on about my opinions, but my opinion is mine, and I did the research to make that conclusion. So I really hope that you will do that too. So
right, I think just based off of looking at it, which what I would have done in high school, looking at that picture instead of reading, the words next to it, I would be like, yeah, that looks true.
Right, yeah, that looks like evolution. It does look like we come from, turtles or birds, because they all look similar. And
right.
it's not, that's not the conclusion that they're making.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the conclusion that we make
Mhm.
because we are not like, you know, peeling back a layer and looking into it deeper.
Absolutely, which I think it just proves kind of our whole point of, or you can be presented with all of these different
Mhm.
diagrams or all of these different writing paragraphs, essays,
Mm-hmm.
but then you have to kind of take that step back to inform your own conclusions and not just simply, yep, that looks great, so I'm going to agree with
Right.
Michael.
And I feel like that's just our main point, like you just
Mm-hmm.
said. Don't take our word for it. Don't take anyone's word for it. And not even just with evolution, but just within life
Mm-hmm.
generally. Like, if it's political, if it's mathematical, if it's scientific, if it's English and literature, in any way, it's just like we really want you to be informing and educating yourself, asking questions from a compassionate, honest heart, willing to rather not being like, change my mind, prove me wrong,
Right.
but rather like, I'm not certain and I'm willing to concede because that's what happened to me. Because if you would have snatched me 2 years ago and been like, defend evolution, I would have been like, let's go because I believe it. And then I've asked myself deeper questions since becoming a Christian, and I'm just not certain that the conclusions that scientists are confidently making can be so confidently drawn. And on one level or another, the evidence is either isn't there and it's a step of faith, or they're extrapolating evidence that I believe cannot be put in that context. So, yeah. And then lastly, just God is good. If you're researching and you're looking at these things and you doubt that, I would recommend looking at the Bible and what you know to be true about God and pausing and really like taking your heart condition into account, because at the end of the day, God's will be done, and I believe that He is perfectly good. And so if I ever interpret information that calls that into question, I take my time.
Yeah.
I think one of the big things that we often look at is that science and faith don't and cannot coexist.
I absolutely agree. It's so often put into this kind of dichotomy that's like opposite ends of the spectrum. You can take that last slide off the thing so we can just like talk and chill. But essentially that like science, you can't be a Christian and like science, and you can't be a scientist and like Christianity, or that they're like oil and water, and I just don't necessarily agree that. I mean, I love science. I'm a logical person. I like to seek truth, and because of that drive in me, I place my faith in Christ. And yeah, I mean, like I said, I could talk about it for forever, but it's just not true that you can't be a scientist or like science and be a Christian. I will say it's not easy, but not because of science being like at ends with Christianity, just because it's just not easy to be a Christian, and that's biblical, not because of science, but because Jesus makes it clear that like in any level, whether it's, if we're going to put it into the academic context, or if we're going to put it into an evangelism context or a relational context, it's just not easy being Christian, because Jesus proved it with His life and His death and His resurrection and all of it. So yeah. Blah. Woof.
I would say in a lot of cases, being a Christian should lead us into the pursuit of truth and knowledge.
Yeah.
Because if God is good and God is real, then God has made all truth that is known and what will be known. And so all truth has to be good to know. And so in that sort of sense, like as the reason I think it's so interesting that currently we stand in a place where religion and science like just do not mix. We're coming out of a place where religion and science, it was the reason why we had science. Because if God made everything...
Right, it was like with pursuing God, it was like that is the intent. One of my friends put it once is like, it's not truth that's hurtful, it's the delivery. And so like truth in itself shouldn't be painful, but if someone is not delivering it out of a compassionate heart, it can be. Or the receiver, if they're not receiving it on compassion, or we have those sinful pre-existing notions, then the truth can be seemingly painful. But so we have 10 minutes where we can talk about whatever you'd like. we can answer some deeper questions about what we've talked about, or maybe something that I said that wasn't clear, something on the slide that wasn't clear. If you're watching, please take this time to, this is a safe place to just ask whatever you have. So, I love science, obviously, and I don't think that it's bad. And so if if a Christian is saying science is bad, then it's not biblical in my opinion. And if a scientist is saying Christianity is bad, well,
Also not biblical.
clearly I'm going to tell you that's not biblical,
Right.
right? So, yeah.
In that terms of biblical, next week we're going to kind of
Yeah.
unpack more about kind of what the Bible has to say about this kind of stuff. And, we talked a lot about the science behind evolution and all that kind of stuff. And like we said, you can coexist with them, right? And so next week, we're going to come back and kind of show you, we talked briefly about it, gave like that definition, but the creationism. And we're going to kind of unpack that a little bit more for you too. Because I think then after both of these deep dives, then that sets you up for great conversations with any friend of yours. Because now you'll have not both sides, or both, I don't know if that's the right term, but both
informed perspectives, right? Naturalism,
Mhm.
deism, theism.
Mhm.
We're going to see more about religious pursuit of origins of life.
Mhm.
Yep.
No
Well,
one's asking any questions.
no questions.
Nope.
Everybody just really understands evolution. It's just perfect.
I mean, it's our solar system.
It's-
That's why, like, when you listen to Josh McDowell, he often quotes a proverb where the person who speaks first in court seems right until they're cross-examined.
Right.
And in this particular case, a lot of times evolution and naturalism specifically gets the first say, which is kind of a weird thing because, like, if you grow up in the church, like you should
Other
have
way
heard
around.
about this, but we just typically don't talk about it until you're at this point. And that's not because we're scared of it, but in a lot of cases, a lot of people
Sometimes.
don't feel the need to worry about it. Like, science is out here and my faith is over here, and they're
They don't
separate.
ever cross
and
paths.
And oh, hey, okay, so Rachel Spence just said, what do you suggest to say in the science classroom if a teacher directly attacks the Bible?
Yeah, so I've experienced this personally, and there are multiple ways that you can approach that. Sometimes I've chosen not to say anything, and it's not because I don't think nothing can be said. I check my heart, and if I don't think I can answer it lovingly, then it's not something that I feel like the Lord would want me to say. But also because I think it's so important. And I was even talking to one of my friends who's a Christian and a biology major last night, and she was like, God doesn't need me to defend him. God doesn't need me to make a case to every single person to prove that evolution is not true. I chose biology as a major because I want to see the beauty of his creation. And every class she's taken in biology that addresses this, she's just reveled in the beauty of the Lord. And I think that is just such a biblical way to approach this. And so if we hear those comments, I mean, it's going to happen. If it's not from a teacher, it might be from a friend or a student, or, on the TV screen or something. I think it's just important to know that that's not our job to prove the existence of God to every person. But if you feel called to say something, I would recommend saying, like, I don't know the context of a specific comment, but I can give an example of something that I've experienced where there are certain theories like evolution or physics theories that they operate on the context of no God. And so one time a teacher said to me, or to the class, but kind of to me, like it was to the class, but it was like to me. And so they said, to Christian students, I say, who are you to say you know what God thinks, wants, says, does, right? And so what I would say in a conversation is that, like, well, I've read the Bible and I've made my decision to say that I believe that this is true. And I really hope that maybe you might too. And so if it's a science teacher, they probably love science. So science often is an investigation. something to discover or understand. And so I would just ask them rather than trying to prove something or say something. It's like, oh, that's really interesting. Have you ever investigated the Bible? Have you looked into the credibility of Darwin? What about the biblical authors of like Paul, the epistles? Have you looked into his credibility? I'd really love to hear your thoughts about that. In my experience, people love talking about things that they're passionate about or themselves. And so if you show genuine interest, those maybe attacking phrases like the Bible can't possibly be true or something like that might now shift into like, well, I don't feel like the Bible is true because I saw this thing. And then there's room now to have a conversation. Unfortunately, sometimes that feels like because we have to, do a little bit more heavy lifting in the conversation to keep the peace and be kind and compassionate, but that's biblical, to love that other person, even if they're not loving us, right? Like check out the Beatitudes or Jesus, like literally yesterday I wrote in my journal, Jesus never expected what he gave. Jesus gave perfectly, and we can't give him that back, but we can try to be Jesus to others. And so in that conversation, if that's your heart intention, then I really think that you're going to honor the Lord well. So I really hope that helped at least a little bit. If you want to give more specifics, then I might give you a more specific answer on what I might say. But
I would on the flip side of that, I would also say that knowing your stuff and being confident is really important.
Yeah.
And to not, if they present new information that you were not made ready for, to not act shocked or like, oh no, I'm gonna lose now. The goal is not to win or to lose, but to present a clear and concise argument. And so if you are gonna say something back, questions are great. That's what Jesus did. If they're giving it to the point where you can give an account of what you are.
Yeah,
you
or
have
give
a-
your testimony.
An issue of that. And there's some things that I think one of the best things you can do is ask what they have studied and why they hold the position that they hold.
Yeah.
Is it based simply off of the world, view that they have, carried through their life? Is it something that happened in the church that really hurt them? A lot of, our teachers are of the age where they might have grown up within the church, which means then there's a reason they are no longer currently in the church. And even for scientists, it's not just typically, well, like I studied microbiology and I just decided I was out. Well, maybe I started to study microbiology. I asked my pastor about this thing. He didn't have a good answer. And I looked at Darwin and it seemed like his answers were pretty good.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And it's like, so finding out where they're coming from and why they hold those views are super duper important.
Yeah, it's so important to make that conclusion. Like behind a statement, behind a statistic, behind a viewpoint is a person. And no matter how logical the person, they have feelings and experiences. And so my personal opinion is that we can never be without bias because of that. And so that might be shifting and informing their perspective, just like we kind of explained earlier. And so sometimes the best way to convince a person is to care for a person first. So, yeah. I love that question. That's a great question. It means that you're prepared and ready to think about what I might say in response to someone saying something that doesn't align with my viewpoint, which is going to happen. So, yeah, if you would have caught me, like I said, 2 years ago, I would have, been ready to go up to bat for evolution, and I would have been overwhelmingly underprepared to address what I've researched about the Bible. You just, oftentimes, I think on the science side, and this is a leap, this is a opinion that I have, that you don't investigate things that you don't care about. And so if you think that the Bible is so disproportionately not true, you're not going to even look into it but a true good scientist investigates, I think, all angles, no matter how far-fetched they may seem. So, yeah, be sure to tune in next week. We're going to go ahead and end the stream here soon. Is there any other questions? By the time I'm done saying this closing phrase. If you haven't put a question, we're gonna end the stream. But next week, be sure to tune in. Like Lindsay had said, we're gonna hear a lot more from her and a lot less from me. I think. Hopefully, I don't talk. I mean, I talk a lot, so it's hard to not get me to. But hopefully, I'll be a better listener as you were modeling this week. And we'll hear more of the biblical perspective, biblically informed perspective about creationism, and specifically Lindsay's personal experiences of growing up in the church. We've heard a lot of me, and so more of Lindsay next week. I'm really excited. I think it's going to be good. Yeah, I can't wait to hear what you have to say. So tune in, invite your friends. They'll learn about Jesus.
We're at Penn Meadows
Yeah,
on Sunday.
right. Show up to Penn Meadows this Sunday. We're going to be hanging out, playing some games. It's supposed to be super lovely out.
We all will be there.
Yes.
So you'll get to see all of your friends.
You will be
You'll see them, but we will all be
socially
separate.
distancing groups. Yeah.
Yes.
Sarah will enforce that boundary very hard.
See them from a distance.
Yeah.
Wait. All right.
All right. Thanks for coming.